helicopter pilot attacked by a 20-foot Bigfoot. That's the headline. But it doesn't even begin to cover what really happened up there in the Bitterroot Range. What started as a routine aerial survey turned into a nightmare at 4,000 feet when something massive broke through the tree line and came straight at the aircraft. At first, it looked like turbulence. Then came the impact. Metal shuddered, glass cracked, and the pilot swore he saw an arm longer than a man's body slam into the rotor housing. They managed to stay airborne, but that was only the beginning. The instruments went haywire, static filled the comms, and down below, the camera feed caught something moving. Too large, too fast, and far too intelligent. The report was filed. Officials called it storm debris. But the footage tells another story, one they don't want you to see. If a creature that size can bring down a helicopter, what else is it capable of? And how much longer can its existence really be denied? It matters that you showed up today, because in every heart that still believes in wonder, compassion, and quiet strength, we find each other. My name is Mark Ellison, and I need to get this on record while the details are still fresh. After 23 years of flying helicopters, as an Army medevac pilot, then as a civilian contractor, I've learned to document everything. Every flight, every anomaly, every gut feeling that something isn't right. The events I'm about to describe began during what should have been a routine survey contract in Montana's Bitterroot Range. I keep meticulous records, flight logs, fuel calculations, weather conditions, and cockpit audio recordings. It's not just professional protocol, it's survival. When you're flying through mountain passes where the weather can turn deadly in minutes, details matter. The Bitterroots aren't forgiving of mistakes. The terrain is brutal, jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and vast stretches of wilderness where help could be hours away if something goes wrong. The Forest Service contracted me last spring to conduct aerial surveys of beetle-killed pine stands. The mountain pine beetle has devastated millions of acres across the Northwest, leaving behind stands of dead trees that become serious fire hazards. My job was to map the spread using specialized imaging equipment, flying grid patterns over some of the most remote sections of the range. The cockpit of my Bell 407 is essentially my office now. I've customized it with additional instrumentation, a higher resolution GPS system, terrain-following radar, and multiple radio frequencies to maintain contact with various agencies. I also keep my own personal audio recorder running during flights. You'd be surprised how often those recordings prove valuable when reviewing flight data or documenting unusual observations. The Bitterroot Range itself is a forbidding place. The peaks rise abruptly from the valley floor, creating what pilots call a wall of mountains that can trap weather systems and generate severe turbulence. Much of the terrain lies above 7,000 feet, with deep canyons and drainages that rarely see human visitors. The few roads that exist are mostly primitive Forest Service tracks, many only passable a few months each year. Helicopter surveys are essential in this environment. Ground crews would need weeks to cover areas I can document in days, assuming they could even access the more remote sections. But flying here demands constant vigilance. The winds flowing over the ridges create invisible rivers of air that can slam an aircraft down or lift it hundreds of feet without warning. Radio communications are frequently interrupted by static or blocked entirely by the terrain. I've been flying these mountains long enough to know their moods, to read the way clouds build over certain peaks or how the wind patterns shift with the seasons. That's why I notice when something feels off, when the usual rhythms of the wilderness are disrupted. And that's exactly what happened during my last survey rotation, though, at first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Note, this opening establishes Mark's credentials, his professional approach to documentation, and the challenging environment he operates in, while setting up the isolation and danger inherent to the location. It was on my third morning flight when I first noticed something odd. I'd taken off from Hamilton Municipal Airport just after sunrise, the air crisp and clear, as it usually is in early spring. My flight path that day took me up the west fork of the Bitterroot River, following a series of predetermined grid patterns to document the beetle kill in that drainage. The radio interference started around 0 hours. I was flying at 4,500 feet above ground level, well within normal operating parameters for the survey equipment. The static wasn't the usual kind we get from atmospheric disturbance or mountain interference. It came in pulses, almost rhythmic, cutting across all my frequencies, even the emergency band. I keyed the mic on my cockpit recorder, 0-7-0-5 hours, experiencing unusual radio interference in grid sector 12. Signal disruption occurs in 5 to 7 second intervals. No visible weather phenomena that could account for this. The valley below me was one I'd flown dozens of times before. It typically had excellent radio clarity due to its straight configuration and lack of major side drainages. I adjusted my heading slightly to maintain the survey line, trying to ignore the way the static made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's when I caught the first whiff of something that shouldn't have been there. At that altitude, the air is usually pristine, carrying nothing but the clean scent of pine and snow from the ridges. But this was different, a complex mixture of odors that reminded me of chemical preservatives mixed with organic decay. It was faint, just at the edge of perception, but distinctive enough that I made another note. 0-7-12 hours. Unusual olfactory observation, similar to formaldehyde or other preservative chemicals, underlaid with organic decomposition. Altitude 4,500 feet. Wind from the northwest at 15 knots. No visible source. I've learnt to trust my instincts after years of flying in combat zones. Something about the combination of that rhythmic static and the inexplicable odor set off warning bells in my mind. But I had a job to do, and the rational part of my brain offered perfectly reasonable explanations. The static could be equipment malfunction. The smell could be from a natural source I hadn't identified. Yet still, I found myself making more frequent notes than usual, documenting every variation in the interference pattern, and each time the strange odor became noticeable, the survey equipment continued functioning normally, capturing its imagery of the dead pine stands below, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this valley today. 0-7-20 hours. Static interference intensifying in lower section of drainage. Signal disruption now occurring in 3-4 second intervals. Smell becomes more pronounced when flying through areas of heavy radio disturbance. I maintained my professional demeanor, but my hand instinctively tightened on the cyclic control. 20+ years of flying had taught me that when something feels wrong, it usually is, even if you can't immediately identify why. I returned for my second sortie that afternoon around 1400 hours. The weather had held steady clear skies with light winds from the northwest. Perfect flying conditions. My co-pilot, Thompson, joined me for this run since we needed to cover more ground before sunset. "Looking good up here," Thompson said, adjusting his headset. "Should be able to finish the western quadrant before we..." Lose the light. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the terrain below. We were following the same grid pattern as the morning flight. But something caught my attention about 2 miles south of where I'd experienced the radio interference, through gaps. In the canopy, I noticed an unusual pattern of broken branches and disturbed vegetation. "Thompson, take a look at this," I said, banking slightly to get a better angle. "You're 2 o'clock, about half a mile ahead." The disturbance created a distinct line through the forest, maybe 30 or 40 feet wide. It wasn't like any game trail I'd seen before, too wide for elk or moose. And it didn't follow the natural contours of the land like animal paths typically do. Thompson leaned forward, squinting through his side window. "Probably just wind damage from that storm last week," he said with a shrug. "You know how these mountain valleys can funnel the gusts. But I'd seen plenty of wind damage in my years of flying these mountains. This was different. The pattern was too linear, too purposeful. Whatever had moved through there had pushed straight across the slope. Ignoring the terrain's natural lines, I keyed my recorder, 14:25 hours, observed unusual vegetation. Disturbance pattern at coordinates. I read off the numbers from my GPS. Approximate width 30 to 40 feet. Linear progression across slope, contrary to typical wildlife movement patterns. Thompson chuckled. "You and your detailed logs. Mark, sometimes a broken tree is just a broken tree." I managed to smile, but kept watching. As we continued our survey line, I noticed 3 more similar patterns over the next hour, each one marked carefully in my log. They all shared the same characteristics: swaths of disturbed canopy, moving in straight lines regardless of terrain. The last one we spotted was the most distinct. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, highlighting the damage. Something had pushed through that forest with enough force to snap 8-inch diameter branches clean off. I made sure to note the exact time and coordinates. "Getting late," Thompson said, checking his watch. "We should head back while we've got good light." I agreed, but not before making one final pass over the area. As we turned back toward Hamilton, I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't random patterns. There was intention there, something moving with purpose through these remote valleys. But I kept those thoughts to myself, letting Thompson believe I was just being thorough with my documentation. I keyed my recorder, 14:25 hours, observed unusual vegetation disturbance pattern at coordinates. I read off the numbers. From my GPS, approximate width 30 to 40 feet, linear progression northwest to southeast, inconsistent with typical game trails or wind patterns. Thompson chuckled. "You're not one of those Bigfoot hunters, are you, Mark?" I ignored his comment, making another pass over the area to capture more detail with our survey cameras. 20 years of military and civilian flying had taught me to document everything, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Better to have too much data than miss something important. The rest of that flight was uneventful, but 3 days later, everything changed. A fresh snowfall had blanketed the region overnight, leaving about 8 inches of pristine powder across the higher elevations. Perfect conditions for spotting any ground activity. I launched at 0700 hours, the morning sun casting long shadows across the untouched snow. The air was crisp and still, visibility excellent. About 40 minutes into my survey route, I spotted something that made me double-check my instruments. 07:42 hours, I spoke into my recorder, keeping my voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline. observing distinct track patterns on the western ridgeline at 8,300 feet elevation. Coordinates following, I brought the helicopter around for a closer look, maintaining a safe altitude, but dropping low enough to get clear footage. The tracks were massive, each impression measuring approximately 4 feet across. They formed a perfect line along the ridge, evenly spaced at about 8 to 10 feet apart. The morning sun cast deep shadows in each impression, highlighting their depth and definition. Track pattern extends approximately 200 yards, visible before entering dense forest cover to the north. I continued recording. No known roads or trails in this area. Snow depth and track clarity suggest creation within the last 12 hours. My hands were steady on the controls, but my mind was racing. In all my years of flying these mountains, I'd never seen anything like this. The tracks were too large for any known wildlife, too regularly spaced for natural formation, and headed straight into one of the most inaccessible parts of the range. I spent 15 minutes filming and photographing the tracks from multiple angles, officially logging it as a terrain anomaly in my flight records. But listening to the recording later, I could hear the slight tremor in my voice, the uncertainty that crept in despite my best efforts to maintain professional detachment. The tracks led into a section of old-growth forest so dense that even from the air I couldn't see the forest floor. Whatever made those impressions had disappeared into that darkness, leaving only questions behind. The final week of surveys loomed ahead. Each morning, as I ran through my pre-flight checks, the weight of unspoken observations pressed heavier on my mind. Thompson, my survey technician, had grown quieter too. The usual banter about weekend plans or equipment readings had dwindled to essential communications only. Starting our approach to grid section 14, I announced into my headset. Thompson merely nodded, his eyes fixed on his monitoring equipment. The morning sun cast long shadows through the valleys as we maintained our survey altitude of 6,000 feet. The familiar thrum of the rotor blades filled the cockpit, but something felt different, wrong. I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed from below, as if the forest itself had developed awareness. 0800 hours, I spoke into my recorder. Clear conditions, light wind from the northwest at 5 knots. Standard procedure, keeping my voice level despite the unease crawling up my spine. We crossed over a clearing where I'd spotted those tracks in the snow last week. The snow had mostly melted now, but the memory remained sharp in my mind. Thompson adjusted one of his sensors, the clicking of switches unnaturally loud in our shared silence. Mark, Thompson's voice crackled through the intercom, getting some weird interference on the ground scanning equipment. I was about to respond when a sharp crack echoed from below, too loud to be natural, too deliberate to be random. The sound carried clearly despite our altitude and the rotor wash. "Did you hear that?" Thompson asked, his professional demeanor slipping for a moment. "Logging unexpected acoustic anomaly at 0805 hours, I replied, keeping to protocol. Possible ground disturbance. Another crack followed, then another. The sounds tracked our flight path, moving with us. Through the trees, something was keeping pace. I maintained our course, but my hands tightened on the controls. 20 years of flight experience told me this wasn't normal wildlife behavior. Bears don't follow aircraft. Elk don't coordinate movement with helicopter paths. 0812 hours, I continued recording. Multiple acoustic signatures tracking. Parallel to flight path. Speed consistent with ground movement of approximately 30 miles per hour through dense forest terrain. Thompson had stopped even pretending to check his instruments. His gaze was locked on the canopy below, searching for whatever was generating those sounds. The rest of that morning's survey passed in tense silence, broken only by necessary flight communications and the occasional sharp crack from the forest. Below, 3 more survey days remained on the contract. 3 more days of flying over these valleys, knowing something down there was watching, waiting, tracking our movements with unsettling precision. I told myself it was just fatigue, just the isolation of mountain flying playing tricks on my mind. But the logs don't lie, and the audio recordings captured every crack, every movement that shadowed us through the trees that morning. The next morning brought gusting winds that challenged even my most practiced flight corrections. The helicopter swayed as turbulent air rushed between the peaks, forcing me to maintain constant adjustments to our altitude and heading. 0900 hours. I spoke into my recorder. Winds 20 to 25 knots, gusting to 30. Visibility good despite cloud cover at 8,000 feet. Thompson was running his usual sensor sweeps, though I noticed he kept glancing at the tree line more often than his equipment. The wind howled around our windscreen as we banked toward a deep ravine that cut through grid section 16. That's when I saw it, between the swaying pines. A dark figure stood upright. My brain tried to process what my eyes were registering. The height, the mass, the distinctly non-Essene posture. Even at our altitude, I could tell this thing towered over the surrounding vegetation. Contact, visual anomaly, I said automatically into my recorder. Professional instincts kicking in despite my racing pulse. Single biped, estimated height. I hesitated, knowing how this would sound. Estimated height approximately 9'2". 10 feet, observed at coordinates. The figure moved with deliberate purpose, taking 2 massive strides before vanishing into the deeper forest. The movement was smooth, coordinated, nothing like a bear rearing up on its hind legs. Too tall. To be a bear, I muttered into my mic, more to myself than for the record. The words felt heavy, official somehow, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I glanced at Thompson. He sat rigid in his seat, eyes locked straight ahead, pretending to study his readouts. His knuckles were white where they gripped his tablet. Thompson, confirm visual contact, I asked, keeping my voice steady. He shook his head once, sharp and decisive. Nothing to confirm, sir. His voice cracked slightly, just shadows and wind. I wanted to press him, to insist he acknowledge what we'd both clearly seen. But 20 years of military and civilian flight experience had taught me when to push and when to let things lie. Some people need time to process the impossible. 09:15 hours. I continued my recording. Banking west complete. Survey line. The wind buffeted us as we turned, and I could have sworn I heard those familiar cracks following our path again. Even over the rotor wash and gusts, Thompson maintained his rigid silence for the remainder of our flight, speaking only when absolutely necessary for the survey protocols. But I noticed he'd switched off his ground scanning equipment, as if he'd lost faith in the data it could provide. Or perhaps he was afraid of what it might show. The rest of our morning passed in that tense quiet, both of us pretending we were still just doing a routine survey, both of us knowing that something fundamental had shifted in our understanding of these mountains. Back at my small rental cabin that evening, I couldn't shake the image of that figure from my mind. The wind had died down, leaving an unsettling stillness that made every creak of the old building sound amplified. I pulled out my flight recorder, Standard procedure was to review and log any anomalies before filing the day's report. Might as well be thorough, I muttered to myself, plugging in my headphones and starting the playback. The familiar hump up of the rotor. Blades filled my ears as I listened through the morning's flight. Thompson's terse responses, my own measured observations, it all seemed so normal until that moment near the ravine. But as I focused on the background noise, something else caught my attention. I rewound the recording several times, adjusting the audio levels. There, beneath the steady rhythm of the rotors, a distinct pattern emerged. Thud, thud, 3 beats, then a pause. 3 more beats, the sequence repeated with unnatural precision. My mind flashed back to my survival training at Fort Benning 23 years ago. The instructor, a grizzled Special Forces veteran, had gone off script one evening to tell us about strange experiences in remote training grounds. He'd mentioned wood knocks, a supposed form of communication, used by unknown creatures in the deep wilderness. I'd dismissed it then as campfire talk, but these sounds, they weren't random. They weren't the chaotic noise of branches in the wind or wildlife moving through the canopy. They had rhythm, purpose, intelligence. I switched to the recordings from 2 days prior, when we'd first noticed the static interference. Sure enough, buried under the white noise and rotor wash, the same pattern emerged. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. This is insane, I said aloud, rubbing my tired eyes. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive through countless medevac missions, tried to dismiss it. Sound artifacts, equipment, interference, wind patterns. But none of those explanations quite fit. I pulled up the flight data on my laptop, correlating the timestamps of the knocks with our GPS coordinates. They formed a rough triangle across the survey area, centered on that ravine where we'd seen the figure. The audio continued playing in my headphones as I mapped the points. 3 more knocks came through, closer and clearer than the others. Checked the timestamp. This was just after we'd spotted the figure. The sound quality was different too, sharper somehow, as if whatever made them had wanted to ensure they were recorded. I saved the audio files to multiple drives, my personal backup, the official survey records, and a secure cloud storage. Whatever these sounds were, whatever we'd seen out there, I needed to preserve the evidence. But I also knew how this would sound to others. 20 years of credibility could evaporate in an instant if I started talking about mysterious wood, knocks, and giant shadows. The knocks continued to echo in my mind long after I'd stopped the playback, their rhythm matching my heartbeat as I sat in the growing darkness. The morning had started clear, enough perfect conditions for documenting the aftermath of last week's microburst that had torn through the valley. I'd done this kind of damaged assessment dozens of times before, hovering steady while my co-pilot snapped photos of the downed trees and erosion patterns below. Standard procedure, nothing more. We were holding at 800 feet above a natural clearing, the morning sun casting long shadows across the debris field. The air was dead calm, which made what happened next impossible to explain away. Ready for the next series, my co-pilot said, adjusting his camera settings. Just need about 30 seconds here. I kept us steady, both skids level, compensating for the slight mountain breeze. The rotor wash barely disturbed the treetops below. That's when I heard a sharp crack from the tree line, like a massive branch snapping. But this wasn't the sound of natural wood failure I'd heard countless times before. The impact came without warning. Something solid and heavy slammed into our right skid with enough force to shake the entire aircraft. The helicopter lurched violently to the side, and I fought the controls, muscle memory from 20 years of flying kicking in as I yanked us higher. Jesus Christ. My co-pilot's camera clattered against the plexiglass. What the hell was that? My heart hammered as I stabilized. Us at 1,200 feet. The cockpit audio would later capture my rapid breathing, the kind of controlled panic you learn to manage in combat zones. But this wasn't Afghanistan. This was Montana, where physics and reason were supposed to make sense. My co-pilot's voice cracked. He swallowed hard before continuing. Something through that. I saw it coming up from the trees. I kept my eyes locked on the instruments, watching for any sign of damage. Describe exactly what you saw. My tone was clipped, professional, masking the cold dread seeping into my bones. It looked like a log or a thick branch. But Mark, it came up at an angle. Not falling, not blown by wind. It was thrown. He pressed his face against the window, staring down at the clearing we'd just fled. Nothing down there could throw something that high. Nothing natural, anyway. The impact point on our skid would later show deep scratching and wood fragments embedded in the metal. I reported it as debris contact during survey operations in the official log. But that night, reviewing the cockpit audio for the 100th time, I couldn't ignore the rhythmic knocking that had started just seconds before the impact. 3 distinct taps, followed by the crash. Those knocks matched the pattern I'd been hearing in my recordings for weeks now. The same cadence, the same deliberate spacing. Only this time, whatever was making those sounds had decided to do more than just signal its presence. It had reached up and touched us, 800 feet above the ground, where nothing should have been able to reach. I radioed the tower immediately, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing. Through my system, base, this is Survey 473, requesting immediate return. We've had an incident. Copy 473. Nature of incident. The controller's voice crackled through my headset. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Impact damage to right skid. Aircraft is responsive, but requesting priority landing. An inspection. The 15-minute flight back to base felt like hours. Every slight vibration, every minor adjustment in the controls had me on edge. My co-pilot hadn't said another word since we'd cleared the clearing. His face pale as he clutched his camera in white-knuckled hands. We touched down at exactly 9:47 in the morning. The ground crew was already waiting, and I could see Ted, our chief mechanic, jogging over with his toolkit. I powered down methodically, going through my shutdown checklist while trying to keep my hands from shaking. "Holy hell," Ted whispered as he crouched near the right skid. "What did you hit up there?" I joined him, and my stomach dropped. The damage was worse than I'd imagined. Deep gouges ran along the skid strut, and there were actual dents in the metal knot, the kind of marking you'd get from a branch caught. In the wind, embedded in the scratches, were fragments of wood, dark and splintered. "Impact with an unknown object," I said, keeping my voice neutral as other mechanics gathered around. About 800 feet up, clear conditions. Ted ran his fingers along the gouges, frowning. "Mark, I've seen strike damage from just about everything you can imagine. Birds, drones, debris. This ain't like any of those. Something hit you hard, and at an angle that doesn't make sense for that altitude." I spent the next 2 hours filling out incident reports, choosing each word with careful precision. Aircraft encountered impact with unidentified object during routine survey operation. Object appeared to be organic in nature, possibly wooden. Weather conditions clear, no turbulence reported. But you can't keep something like this quiet for long, not in a close-knit aviation community. By evening, word had spread through the pilot's lounge. I overheard fragments of conversations, saw the sideways glances as other crews examined the damage. No way, that's wind damage, 800 feet up. Nothing throws that high. Ellison's not the type to make stuff up. The maintenance team took photographs, collected wood samples for analysis. They measured the impact angles, calculated force trajectories. Everything went into the official report, but none of it added up to a satisfactory explanation. That night, I sat in my office, staring at the incident photos, my coffee long gone cold. The gouges in the metal seemed to mock every rational explanation. I tried to force onto them. 20 years of flying, and I'd never filed a report that felt so inadequate, so unable to capture the truth of what had happened up there, back in my quarters. I sat at the small desk, the events of the day weighing heavily on my conscience. The contract had another week to go, but the thought of returning to those valleys made my stomach churn. 20 years of flying hadn't prepared me for this. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over my supervisor's number, contemplating an early termination of the contract. My young technician, Dave, had barely spoken a word since we landed. During the post-flight debrief, he'd kept his eyes fixed on his notepad, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a pallor that spoke volumes. When I'd tried to discuss the incident, he'd merely shaken his head and mumbled something about needing air. I couldn't blame him. We'd both felt the violent impact that had rocked our aircraft, an impact that shouldn't have been possible at that altitude. The mounted camera footage beckoned from my laptop. I'd been avoiding it, telling myself I needed to file the maintenance reports first. But really, I was afraid of what I might see. With trembling fingers, I connected the memory card and opened the video file. The footage was grainy, typical of our survey cameras in low-light conditions. I scrubbed through the timeline, watching the tree line scroll past until I reached the timestamp of the impact. Frame by frame, I advanced the video, my breath catching in my throat. There, just before the impact, something stood in the tree line. The figure was upright, a dark silhouette against the deeper shadows of the forest. Even accounting for the distance and video quality, it towered above the surrounding vegetation. The proportions were all wrong for a bear or any other known wildlife. In the next frame, motion blur captured something arcing through the air toward our helicopter. Then came the impact we'd felt so violently. I rewound and replayed the sequence several times, each viewing confirming what I'd seen while revealing new details. The figure's movement was fluid, purposeful. The way it had drawn back before the throw spoke of intelligence, of calculated intent. This wasn't some random encounter with debris or weather phenomenon. My hands were shaking as I saved multiple copies of the footage to different drives. Part of me felt vindicated. Here was proof that I hadn't imagined the strange occurrences of the past few weeks, the tracks in the snow, the wood knocks, the feeling of being watched. It all connected now, but that vindication came with a chilling realization. Whatever was out there had escalated from observation to direct interaction. It had demonstrated not just presence, but strength and accuracy that could have ended much worse for us. The dents in our skid were a warning shot. I was sure of it now. I sat back in my chair, the footage still looping on my screen, that dark figure appearing and disappearing like a threat made manifest. The question wasn't just whether to continue the contract anymore. It was whether, I was willing to risk another encounter with something that clearly didn't want us in its territory. The morning dawned cold and clear, a deceptive tranquility, masking my unease. I sat in the cockpit, methodically going through my pre-flight checklist while trying to ignore the tremor in my hands. The clipboard felt heavier than usual as I noted the date and weather conditions. Final valley sweep today, I announced to Tim, who nodded without enthusiasm. He'd been unusually quiet since yesterday, his usual chatter replaced by terse responses and darting glances at the tree line. The helicopter's systems hummed to life, each gauge and dial reading normal. Everything was perfectly ordinary, except for the knot in my stomach that refused to unwind. I reached for the small digital recorder I'd taken to Carina, habit from my military days that had proven unexpectedly valuable these past weeks. Personal note, I spoke into the device, checking the times. October 15th, 0700 hours. One last run, then I'm done with this mountain. I paused, then added, weather conditions optimal, visibility excellent, fuel tanks at 98%. The words felt like both a promise and a prayer. My throat tightened as I tucked the recorder away, remembering the footage from yesterday. That silhouette still haunted my thoughts. Defying rational explanation, Tim finished securing his harness, his movements mechanical. Ready when you are, sir. I nodded, engaging the collective. The rotor wash stirred the morning mist as we lifted off, the familiar sensation of flight doing little to ease my anxiety. The valley stretched before us, a sprawling expanse of pine and shadow. Somewhere in those depths, something waited, something that could hurl logs at helicopters. Maintaining standard survey altitude, I reported into the radio, more for the flight recorder than anyone else. Beginning final sweep of grid section, the morning sun casts long shadows across the landscape, creating dark pockets between the trees that seemed to shift and move. I kept my eyes fixed on the instruments, fighting the urge to scan those shadows too closely. The contract required one more thorough pass through this section, and then we could put this whole unsettling assignment behind us. Just a few more hours, I muttered, mostly to myself. Tim pretended not to hear, his attention fixed on his monitoring equipment. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, a physical presence sharing the space with us. I keyed the recorder again, speaking softly. Addendum to personal note. After this contract, I'm requesting reassignment to lower elevation work. Something about these mountains, I let the thought trail off, unwilling to voice my deeper concerns even in private. The helicopter's shadow glided over the treetops as we began our sweep. The morning silence broken only by the steady thrum of the rotors and the occasional crackle of radio static. Every meter of altitude felt like a fragile barrier between us and whatever lurked in those ancient woods below. The morning silence felt wrong. At this altitude, we usually heard scattered bird calls or the whisper of wind through the pines. But now, the only sound was our rotor wash, creating an artificial bubble of noise that seemed to heighten the unnatural quiet below. Something's off, Tim muttered, his voice barely audible over the intercom. I nodded, keeping the helicopter steady at 3,000 feet. The valley stretched beneath us like a green wound in the earth, shadows still clinging to its deeper recesses despite the morning sun. That's when we heard it. The first crack echoed through the valley, sharp and distinct enough to cut through the helicopter's drone. I instinctively checked our position on the GPS, marking the coordinates in my log. 3 seconds passed. Another crack, just as loud, from a different position. You hearing this? I asked, though Tim's white-knuckled grip on his tablet answered my question. The sounds continued, maintaining their 3-second interval with unsettling precision. Crack, 3 seconds. Crack, 3 seconds. Each report seemed to move, creating a pattern that paralleled our flight path. Mr. Ellison, Tim's voice cracked slightly. We should turn back. This isn't, he swallowed hard. This isn't normal. I kept the helicopter steady, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to bank hard and retreat. Need to complete the sweep, I said, more to convince myself than Tim. Contract requires full coverage of this section. The rhythmic cracking continued, and I clicked on my recorder. 08:15 hours. Documenting unusual acoustic phenomena. Regular intervals, approximately 3 seconds apart. Sound signature similar to trees breaking, but I paused, watching the forest below. Movement appears coordinated with aircraft position. That's when I saw it. Through gaps in the canopy, something massive was keeping pace with us. The trees swayed and parted in its wake, like a shark's fin cutting through water. Whatever it was, it moved with purpose, matching our speed of 120 knots, far too fast for any known wildlife. There, Tim pointed, his finger trembling. 2 of them, look at the pattern. He was right. A second disturbance moved through the forest parallel to the first. The 2 forces working in tandem to maintain that precise 3-second rhythm. Crack. From the left, 3 seconds. Crack from the right. The coordination spoke of intelligence, of planning. I fought to keep my voice steady as I continued recording. Multiple subjects tracking aircraft from forest floor. Speed matching ours. Deliberate pattern suggests a particularly loud crack interrupted me. This one closer to our position. The sound reverberated through the helicopter's frame. Mark. Tim abandoned formality, real fear in his voice now. Please. We need to get out of here. The forest below continued to ripple with movement. Through the breaks in the canopy, I caught glimpses of dark shapes, too quick and too large to process. The cracking sounds maintained their rhythm, but the sources were definitely moving closer to our position, converging from both sides of the valley. Switching to higher altitude, I announced, easing back on the collective. We climbed another 1,000 feet, but the sounds followed us, impossibly loud even at this height. The movement below continued unabated. Those massive forms still pacing us through the forest with impossible speed and precision. Tim had given up any pretense of monitoring equipment, his eyes fixed on the forest below. How are they keeping up with us? Nothing moves that fast through dense forest. Nothing that big. I didn't have an answer. The GPS showed we were maintaining our speed, yet whatever stalked us below matched us stride for stride. The rhythmic cracking continued, a deliberate demonstration of power and coordination that made my skin crawl. These weren't random animal movements or natural phenomena. This was a display meant specifically for us. The impact came without warning. Something massive slammed into our tail rotor, harder than the previous incident days ago. The helicopter lurched violently, and warning alarms shrieked through the cockpit. My hands moved on instinct, fighting the controls as we pitched dangerously to the right. Mayday, mayday. I shouted into the radio, but only static answered. Tim, call it in. On your cell, on your cell. The helicopter's frame groaned under the stress as I wrestled to maintain stability. The altimeter showed we'd dropped 200 feet in seconds, far too close to the canopy for comfort. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Tail rotor stress, engine strain, critical system alerts cascading one after another. No signal. Tim's voice cracked with panic. He clutched his phone with shaking hands, staring at the useless device. That's when we saw it. Through a break in the trees, standing in a small clearing, was something that defied explanation. The figure stood upright, its massive frame silhouetted against the morning shadows. Even at our height, its scale was undeniable, broader than two bull elk standing side by side, with shoulders that seemed to span the width of a pickup truck. The height, God, the height. The trees beside it were mature pines, easily 60 feet tall, and this thing's head cleared their lowest branches. Jesus Christ, Tim whispered. His tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering against the floor. The creature's arm moved with deliberate purpose, reaching down to grasp something from the forest floor. The motion was fluid, too coordinated to be a bear, too powerful to be human. Its dark fur rippled with muscle beneath. Hold on. I yanked the collective, forcing our altitude to climb. The engine whined in protest as we ascended, but I couldn't risk another hit. Not this close to the canopy, not with that thing below us. Tim's single quotes breathing came in short, sharp bursts. Did you see? I saw it. I confirmed, my own voice hardly steady. I'm still recording. 0823 hours. Visual confirmation of upright biped estimated height. I swallowed hard. Estimated height exceeding 60 feet from ground level. Build consistent with primate morphology, but scale unprecedented. Subject demonstrated tool use and coordinated targeting of aircraft. The helicopter continued to shudder as we gained altitude. I kept my eyes locked on the instruments, fighting the urge to look down again. The warning lights gradually began to clear as we put distance between ourselves and the valley floor. 3,000 feet. 4,000. 5,000. Check the tail camera, I ordered Tim, trying to keep him focused. Any visible damage? He fumbled with the display screen, hands still trembling. Dents, deep dents in the tail assembly, like someone squeezed it, metals warped but holding. The rhythmic cracking had stopped, but the silence felt even more oppressive now. I maintained our climb until we reached 7,000 feet, well above the typical survey altitude. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Tim, I said carefully, I need you to write down everything you saw, every detail. We're heading back to base, but I want independent observations while they're fresh. He nodded numbly, picking up his fallen tablet. They won't believe us. No, I agreed, keeping the helicopter pointed toward home. But they'll have to explain the damage, and the recordings, and both our statements. The morning sun finally crested the mountain ridge ahead of us, but its warmth did nothing to dispel the cold certainty settling in my gut. We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, and it had seen us too. The landing back at base was rough but controlled. My hands were still shaking as I powered down the engine, the rotor blades slowly spinning to a stop above us. Tim practically fell out of his door the moment we touched down, stumbling onto the tarmac and doubling over like he might be sick. Easy. I called after him, completing my shutdown checklist with mechanical precision. 20 years of military discipline kept my movement steady, even as my mind raced. We need to document everything before anyone touches the aircraft. I grabbed my phone and began photographing the damage. The tail assembly bore deep impressions, not random dents from debris, but distinct patterns that looked disturbingly like grip marks. The metal was warped and twisted in a way that suggested enormous pressure applied from multiple points. The skid where we'd been hit in the previous incident still showed those unexplainable gouges. Within 30 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, followed by a Forest Service representative in his pressed khaki uniform. The man from the Forest Service carried a clipboard and wore the carefully neutral expression of someone prepared to explain away anything unusual. "Walk me through what happened," the senior deputy said, flipping open his notepad. I recounted the incident in precise detail, the impact, the system warnings, the figure we'd observed. I kept my voice steady and professional, focusing on measurable facts, timestamps, altitude readings, equipment status. Tim stood nearby, nodding occasionally but letting me do the talking. The Forest Service representative cleared his throat. "We've had significant wind events in that valley this week. Numerous dead trees and loose debris. Most likely you encountered some airborne material caught in an updraft." "With all due respect," I said, pointing to the tail assembly debris, "doesn't leave marks like this. These are grip patterns, consistent pressure points. And both my co-pilot and I observed Mr. Ellison." He cut in, his tone carefully measured. "I understand you've had a frightening experience, but we need to focus on explanations consistent with known phenomena. Wind-thrown debris is the most likely cause." I turned to Tim. "Tell them what you saw." Tim shifted uncomfortably, looking between me and the officials. There was definitely something down there, something big, but he swallowed hard. Maybe the light was playing tricks. It happened pretty fast. The deputy made a few notes. "So you're not certain about what you observed?" "I'm certain," I insisted, pulling out my tablet. "I have the cockpit recordings, the external camera footage. We'll need copies of those." "For our report," the Forest Service representative said smoothly. "Along with your flight logs and any other documentation." I could see it happening, the slow, methodical dismantling of our experience into something safe and explainable. The deputies took basic statements, but showed little interest in the details of what we'd actually seen. Their report would probably read as a routine incident involving weather and debris. After they finished, I caught Tim before he could leave. "You know what we saw out there?" He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mark, I've got a family, a mortgage. I can't be the guy who claims he saw Bigfoot attack a helicopter. No one would ever hire me again." "It's not about Bigfoot," I argued. "It's about documenting what actually happened. Something intelligent targeted our aircraft. Twice. That's a safety issue. And I filed my incident report," he said quietly. "But that's as far as I'm going with this. I'm sorry." I watched him walk to his car, shoulders hunched. I couldn't really blame him. I'd seen the Forest Service representative making notes about my state of mind during the interview. One wrong move, and my own career could end up grounded. Later that afternoon, I examined the helicopter again, taking more detailed photos of the damage. The maintenance crew had already begun repairs, but the evidence was there if you knew what to look for. The metal told a story that no wind-thrown debris could explain. A story of precisely applied force, of deliberate contact. The Forest Service representative appeared beside me, his clipboard tucked under his arm. "The official report will list this as weather-related damage," he said. "I suggest you align your own documentation accordingly. You know that's not what happened." He glanced around before speaking softly. "Mr. Ellison, some things are better left uncategorized. File your report, finish your contract, and move on. Trust me on this. Something in his tone made me look closer. There was knowledge behind his practiced dismissals, perhaps even fear. But he was already walking away, back straight, clipboard restored to its proper position. Just another official doing his job, explaining away the inexplicable. Stood there in the fading daylight, looking toward the mountains where something impossible had revealed itself. The evidence was already being erased. Repairs would remove the physical marks. Reports would reduce it to mundane explanation, and witnesses would choose silence over ridicule. But I knew what I had seen. What we had seen. My phone buzzed, with a text from Tim. I'm requesting a transfer to different routes. Nothing personal. I didn't bother responding. Instead, I opened my personal flight log and began writing everything down in detail. Every observation, every measurement, every moment of that encounter. They could explain away the official record, but they couldn't erase my own. I submitted my resignation letter 3 days later. The company tried to convince me to stay, offering different routes, better pay, but my mind was made up. 20+ years of flying had taught me to trust my instincts, and everything in me said it was time to ground myself. The footage from that final flight never made it into official channels. I'd made copies before submitting the originals, watching as bureaucracy did what it does best, burying uncomfortable truths under layers of paperwork and plausible explanations. But word spreads in aviation circles. Other pilots started reaching out, sharing their own stories in hushed tones over late-night calls or private messages. Had something similar happen over in Idaho. One veteran pilot told me. Never reported it. Who'd believe it? The copies of my footage moved through trusted hands. Grainy images of that massive silhouette, the audio of impact and panic, the systematic knocking that echoed through the valley, all preserved despite official denials. Some dismissed it as tricks of light and shadow, stress-induced hallucinations from a tired pilot. Others watched in silence, adding it to their own private collections of unexplained encounters. Tim transferred to southern routes, far from the Bitterroot Range. We haven't spoken since that day, though I heard through mutual friends that he refuses to fly anywhere near those mountains. Can't say I blame him. Before leaving, I made one final recording in the cockpit of that same helicopter, now repaired and cleared for service. The maintenance crew had erased all evidence of those impossible grip marks, but they couldn't erase memory. I clicked on the recorder, the same one that had captured everything else, and left what I hoped would serve as a warning to whoever might follow. This is Mark Ellison, former Army medevac pilot. Final statement regarding the range incidents. To any pilot working these routes, if you fly that valley, don't hover. Don't give it time to notice you. Whatever's up there, and something is up there, it's intelligent enough to recognize patterns, to anticipate flight paths. It's strong enough to reach aircraft at hover height. And it's watching. I paused, considering how much more to say. Then continued, the official record will tell you it was debris, weather, mechanical issues. But the truth is out there in those trees, standing taller than any known creature, moving with purpose and intelligence. I don't know what it is. I don't want to know any more. Just keep moving. Don't give it a target. I sealed that final recording with my personal files, alongside copies of the footage and my detailed flight logs. Let others debate whether it was all delusion or genuine contact with something beyond our understanding. I know what I saw. I know what hunts those skies. These days, I stick to ground transport. Sometimes, on clear nights, I'll look toward those mountains and catch myself listening for rhythmic knocks echoing through the valleys. But I never fly there anymore. Some airspace is better left unchallenged. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.